What's in this box might change bashing forever, and today we're going to discover it together. When I started in this hobby 25 years ago, this is what a modern basher looked like. This was state of the art at the turn of the millennium, but today it is slow, weak, and hard to work on. By comparison, modern bashers are absolute tanks and powerhouses. We've got stronger bodies made out of better materials, advanced plastics and advanced plastic design, far superior brushless electric systems, steering servos that don't break the instant you look at them. But one of the most critical aspects to a basher is something that barely has changed at all, and that's the suspension. As you can see, this truck was designed before we were worried about Y2K. It has an upper arm, a lower arm, some springs, and check this out. These are Ultra Shocks. You know what else has Ultra Shocks? This brand new, recently updated Rustler 4x4. These shocks are nearly identical to the ones you just saw on that 30-year-old design. But why does it matter? Why do we care how advanced those shocks are? Well, it matters a lot because those shocks are responsible for making sure you have a good time when you're out bashing. Roll over in a turn, your shocks are responsible. Bounce on a landing and end up upside down, that's your shocks. Keep winding up on your lid on rough terrain, you guessed it, that's gonna be the shocks. But why? Why are the shocks so important to how a basher handles and runs? Before I tell you about how the suspension works, why don't I show you what would happen if you didn't have suspension by locking the suspension out in this Kagama and going and bashing it. Completely locking out the suspension is something I've never tried on one of these basher vehicles before, and I'm just as curious as you are to see what happens. And I think the most effective way to accomplish that's going to be to go ahead and just lock out these shocks. And in order to lock out the shock, we're just going to replace the spring with a piece of tubing I happen to have on hand that's actually exactly the right size. Let me get this cut and I'll show you what I mean. And there we go. As you can see, no more spring, no more suspension. And now putting the shock back on the truck, we can see this corner is completely locked out. Now I'm just gonna do the exact same thing for the other three corners, just like that. That feels really ridiculous. Now we haven't lost every bit of our suspension, even though the actual suspension is locked out. I'll explain why when we get back, but for now, let's go see how this thing behaves.
So what is it like with no suspension? Well, even driving really slowly on this fairly smooth ground, this thing is bouncing all over the place and it feels absolutely awful. It feels like driving a concrete block. As you can see, the wheels are jumping up off the ground with every single bump, which means we're losing a ton of traction, and it just feels really, really bad overall. Turning is also affected, and it is just not a very pleasant experience. You see it bouncing over those? This thing feels like a lowrider that was not done properly. All right, now over even rougher terrain, this thing becomes basically undrivable. It has basically no traction. You can see we've got a tire hanging in the air right there, and this is a pretty small bump. Trying to get over it, it just, again, feels really, really bad. The bumping of the chassis is one thing, but the lack of traction is the real problem here. Look at that. We've got no traction, and we barely made it over that. I suspect things aren't going to be any better when we increase the speed. Let's see. Yeah, that is really, really awful. And this is not a surprise. These cars have suspension for a reason. But the question is, what is the suspension? What is it doing? And how does it help?
Put simply, the sole purpose of a vehicle's suspension is to decouple the wheel and tires motion from the motion of the rest of the chassis. How it does this can be as simple as using a flexible piece of plastic like you see right here, or as complex as the crazy systems you see on full-size desert racers. The reason we want to decouple the motion of the wheels and tires from the rest of the chassis is twofold. First of all, we're trying to reduce the motion of the main mass of the car as much as possible, but that leads into the second and actually more important reason. The main purpose of your suspension, especially in a car that doesn't actually have anybody riding inside, is to keep the tires in contact with the ground as much as possible. There are two main things at play here. The first one is that most cars have 4 wheels and tires, and something with 4 points of contact has a really hard time keeping all 4 of those points in contact unless the surface is completely smooth. From a physics standpoint, as soon as you introduce anything but a perfectly smooth surface, we don't have 4 points in contact anymore. Looking back at the driving we did, this was really evident as we went over bumps. The other main consideration is the trajectory of the vehicle itself. If we hit a bump and we have no suspension, the entire vehicle is going to lift up in the air and it's going to want to try to continue on that trajectory. As you can see, there's air between this tire and this bump right now. Eventually it will come down and make contact again, but during that entire time it's in the air, the wheel that's in the air is doing absolutely nothing. nothing. That's what we're trying to avoid. And we do that by introducing a spring. A spring is able to absorb and release kinetic energy. So with the addition of a spring, when you drive over that bump, some of that energy gets stored in the spring and then released again as you come off that bump. Of course, in the real world, the surface is a series of bumps, but each one of them is just an individual bump. There are all types of springs in the world. This car uses a coil spring for that suspension motion, but this tire itself is also a spring. It's not a very good one for suspension, but it is a spring. Okay, so we know why the suspension's there, we know why the spring's there, but why is the shock absorber there? To find out, let's go ahead and take the fluid out of these shock absorbers, effectively disabling them, and see what happens. Yeah, because this thing is pretty new, we're just gonna go ahead and save the oil because it is gonna be going back in. And we have one disabled shock absorber. Let me do that to the other three, and I'll see you outside.
Starting out on a smooth surface, as you can see, it's really not that bad. It handles fairly similarly to what it would if it had fluid in the shocks. And that's because this is a smooth surface and the springs aren't really doing much. On a really smooth surface like this, you really don't need suspension nearly as much as you do on a rough surface. Off-road, however, things completely change. This thing bounces around like crazy and has very little control. As you can see, it really does not handle well, and this is with a little bit of fluid left in the shocks. They're not completely empty, so they're still doing a little bit of work, but this thing really feels completely different than it did when we had fluid in those shocks and this thing was straight out of the box. It's bouncing and flopping around and is actually nearly impossible to keep going straight, and that's with the TSM turned on, so this thing's got a gyro helping it.
So why does removing the shock oil make this thing handle so much worse off-road? To put it simply, a coil spring really has no friction. It is this lack of friction that opens up the very complex world of dampers or shock absorbers. By the way, there is a certain type of friction that occurs when you compress and extend a coil spring. This is a microscopic molecular friction inside the metal itself, which will actually cause a little bit of heating of the spring, but that's kind of beyond the scope of this video. With that being said, what is the problem with not having any friction in the spring? Well, basically it means the suspension is uncontrolled. Without anything to control the movement, when that suspension hits a bump, the spring's going to compress and then want to do this over and over and over again. Extend that out over a bunch of bumps and you get what we had outside, where the thing is just bouncing all over the place in an uncontrolled manner. The other big problem with not having any way to control this is that if you're going to be landing a big jump, you're going to have the springs so stiff that they're not going to work over rough terrain. And that's where the topic of this video comes into play, the shock absorber. As you can see with this spring, when I compress it, it just bounces all over the place. With a shock absorber, you can tell that motion is being damped, and that's being damped by fluid inside here. There are a ton of different ways you can damp that spring movement. The vast majority of RC cars use a little cylinder with a rod going in it and then a plate with holes in it that liquid gets squished through back and forth. The problem with this, and hopefully what we're going to be solving today, is that this is a very rudimentary damper. The behavior of your suspension has more to do with how your car handles than anything else, so it's really important, and the shocks on most of these cars just aren't very good by modern technological standards. The little piston in here with holes in it creates what's known as a speed-sensitive damper. Basically, if I push this really slowly, there's not a lot of resistance, but if I push it quickly, I get a lot of resistance. This can be good for landing a big jump because it's going to try to move quickly and give you a lot of resistance to really damp that motion, but that same feature is going to be a detriment over rough terrain because you're going to get heavy damping where you actually want it to be kind of loose. Because of this, especially for the kind of general bashing we do these days, which is a bunch of off-road rough stuff and jumping, suspension tuning is always a serious compromise between having things loose enough to keep the wheels on the ground going over rough terrain and tight enough to be able to land a big jump without bouncing in the air and flipping over. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is where position-sensitive damping comes in. Now, before we dig into all of this, we need to get a baseline with the speed-sensitive damping on our Kagama Limited Edition, so let me get the springs put back in and let's go see how it feels. Before we do, though, it's time for a quick side quest because I just got this brand new transparent ramp from 911 Motorsports and I want to get it together now. Opening this thing up, it looks really well built. We've got some cool custom nut inserts to put the frame together with, which looks pretty straightforward. We just put these bowed pieces in between the long straight parts, tighten down these bolts, then we place our sheet of polycarbonate on top, clamp it down, drill some holes, and then screw the center area together. Then we're gonna go around the outside drilling, chamfering, and screwing. While I'm doing this, if you like these kinds of videos, make sure you get subscribed because we've got some really awesome stuff coming and you're not gonna wanna miss it.
There we go, guys. This thing looks really, really cool, and it seems like it's gonna be nice and strong. Now let's put it and those stock shocks to the test. Team Corrali is actually really good with tuning their suspension, but like I said, with speed-sensitive suspension, it's always going to be a compromise between jump landing and general off-road handling, and this car kind of leans more toward jump handling than general off-roading, which means it lands jumps really well, though you did see a bit of a bounce there, which we're hoping to be able to solve. Let's see how this new ramp works. Not too bad. Overall, this feels pretty good, and it's about as good as you're gonna get with the rudimentary type suspension that we see in pretty much every RC car out there these days.
And while these old shocks are the past, this is the future. These are the SOTA position-sensitive shock inserts, and the beauty of these is they're gonna go right into the shocks we already have. There's a lot going on here, and it can seem very intimidating at first, but it's actually pretty simple. We're gonna take one of these inserts and slide it inside the shock body. This insert is not a circle, as you can see here. And then we're gonna replace our normal circular shock pistons with one of these, which also is not circular. That's gonna fit in here, and it's gonna travel through this insert. As it travels up and down, it's gonna move between different zones where shock fluid will get pushed out of one of these slots and into another. So for instance, in this zone, shock fluid will be getting circulated between these two slots here and is going to be regulated by this little pill right here. These pills have different depths to them, and they're going to let more or less fluid through depending on how you set it up. Because there are multiple zones, we can have a different amount of damping here and a different amount of damping here and then a different amount of damping here as well. This means we can have a nice soft plush ride for handling normal rough terrain, and then we can have much firmer damping when we land a jump and much firmer damping right at that top out section. The other beautiful thing about this is that it takes this little plate that covers these holes, and this plate is going to allow fluid to flow one direction but not the other. That means we can have more damping in compression than in rebound. The reason we want that is because when you land a jump, you have the entire mass of the car pushing the suspension up, but when that suspension unloads, you only have the mass of the unsprung weight pulling it back down again. Because of this, you end up with more effective rebound damping than you do compression damping, which is not something we want. Not only is this little valve going to fix that problem, but it's also completely tunable. All right, guys, enough theory. Let's get this installed. And of course, the first step is to go ahead and take this stock shock apart. We're going to be going ahead and dumping out the stock fluid. These inserts require some pretty heavy stuff. A couple of the configurations I was given actually call for differential thickness of fluid. But for these rears, we're going to be running 800 CST. You can find CST to weight conversion charts, but since weight isn't something that's actually calculated with a formula, there is no direct conversion from one to the other. CST is a measure of viscosity. It's actually done using testing. So this is the number that's consistent. Once we get the fluid out of there, we're just going to take the nut off of the stock piston. Most of the time you'll be able to do this without taking the entire shock apart. In order to make the nut easier to control, put a little piece of VHB in here behind it. That'll kind of push it out so that it doesn't get lost up in the wrench. And now we can just take this piston and dump it out because we're not going to be using it anymore. You'll want to make sure the washer also came out because we're going to be using a new washer. This washer is going to be thicker and more supportive than the stock one, but you want to be careful because there is a recess on one side. That side's going to go down. An easy tip for assembly is just to take the piece that you're putting on the shaft, stick it onto a screwdriver or something like this, then just touch that screwdriver to the top of the shaft and it'll slide right on there. Next step's going to be pretty fiddly because we need to put these tiny grub screws in. The kit does come with a hex wrench for this, but I've got a bigger one, so we're going to go ahead and use that. Basically, we're just going to take one of these little grub screws and put it in the top of the piston in the hole on the side, screw that in until it's just coming out from the bottom. All it does is keep the rebound valve rotationally in position. And then we're going to grab one of these little upper collars and put it in. Now with this assembled, we just need to put that on the shaft, and then we're just going to put our nut back on. The last thing we need to do before final assembly is set up our insert. Like I said, these little pills have different depths to them, and those different depths allow different amounts of fluid through. What I'm going to do for now is go ahead and set this up to where it's fairly loose in the middle. That's gone. Don't worry, we got plenty of extra inserts, but I'm going to use this purple insert in the middle, and then I'm going to use these red inserts on the top and bottom. Obviously, this is all still in the prototype stages, so we don't know exactly what's going to be best, but I think this is a decent starting point. Now, of course, assembly and bleeding is going to be quite a bit different than what you're used to with a normal shock, but we're just going to go ahead and fill this up most of the way with fluid. This is 800 CST, like I said. We're going to go about 3/4 of the way up. Then we're going to take our insert and slowly push it in. This angled slot's at the top. Of course, it'll only go over the piston one way, and we're just going to slowly push that in, letting some of the air out as we go. Go nice and slow so you don't push a bunch of fluid out. And we want to go ahead and top this off. And then holding the insert with your nail or your finger right here on the flat, very slowly move this up and down. This is going to be a bit different than what you're used to because there are 3 different chambers in here. And so there are 3 different places for air to get trapped. One thing that I noticed is that if you go all the way to the top and then pull it back down, there's a good chance you're going to draw air into the top chamber again. So the best thing I found to do is just slowly slowly move this up and down until you feel pretty confident you've got most of the air out of everything. Then just let it sit for a few minutes. While we're waiting for that, we can go ahead and swap out the bladder. We don't use this normal stock style bladder anymore. We're gonna use this more flat style bladder, and it goes in just like this. This actually feels nice and high quality. Probably don't use a sharp object to push it in. Once you feel pretty comfortable, you got most of the air out of here, go ahead and take the top, put it on, get it on almost to where it makes that seal, and then with the hole facing up, slowly push the shaft all the way up. A bunch of fluid and air should come out, and then close it up. Now, once you're done, make sure you go ahead and cycle it a few times and see if you feel air in there. If you feel a bunch of air bubbles in there or hear a bunch of air bubbles, you'll probably want to go ahead and do this again. This one actually feels really, really good. And then when you're done, you can test it. You should be able to feel 3 distinct damping zones. The way I have this one set up, it's pretty stiff at the bottom. It moves into a nice soft area in the middle, and then it gets really stiff again at the top. Without actually feeling this, I wish there was feel-o-vision. It's hard for me to describe what this feels like, but it definitely does feel like the future. Is it the future though? Let me get the rest of these built and let's go find out.
We're gonna start out on some fairly smooth asphalt to see how it feels, and it actually is pretty interesting because it gets a little bit of tip and then locks out. Actually has quite a bit of anti-sway property, which feels really interesting. Picking up a bit more speed and then stopping. Yeah, it feels really controlled. It definitely does feel different than anything I've ever felt though. It's a different driving experience. Moving over to a mixture of grass and sand, again, it really does feel very composed. It has this kind of strange feeling to it where it's super smooth and then kind of locks out as it gets to a certain point. And that's definitely going to be those shocks hitting the different zones of damping. And so far, I'm really impressed with it. I think this definitely feels better than it did out of the box. And this is pretty cool. It's so plush over the rough stuff. Let's go even rougher. All right, now this terrain is rough enough to upset pretty much any basher. And this thing really does seem to be handling it better than I would expect it to, especially for something that is normally tuned for jumping. It feels really, really compliant, really plush, and stays planted. You can see those tires trying to stay down on the ground, and it really working the terrain. The suspension is so plush in that middle region that it just really wants to stay planted, but as soon as it gets to a certain point in up travel and down travel, it gets into that firmer damping zone, and then it locks right out and ends up not wanting to roll over as much. It rolled over there, but that was pretty bad. You can see the hole it just fell into. Pretty much anything would roll over on that. Yeah, I mean, this is some pretty gnarly terrain, and it did flip over, but in general, it's handling it really, really well. You could tune a suspension to handle this kind of terrain, but it would be so soft that it probably wouldn't be able to jump. Let's see if this thing can. I personally think we still have this thing tuned too soft. But yeah, it still handled that jump pretty well. I think we could go with a little bit thicker fluid, as it is very soft in the middle, and we could probably stiffen it up a little bit, but it's still handling those landings pretty well. Again, especially for how soft and compliant the suspension is over the rough terrain. Oh, that was my fault. But, you know, it handled it, and it's handling this wet grass really well. There's just a feeling to it I can't really explain, where it's nice and plush, and then it just locks, almost like there's a really stiff sway bar on it. This car does have sway bars, but it definitely didn't feel like that before. Yeah, it handles jumps pretty well, but let's go see how it handles some big jumps. Now, based on what we got off the smaller ramp, I'm expecting some bounce on landing here. Oh, not really much though. Yeah, that actually feels really nice. Let's get up some more speed. Oh my. Oh my gosh, that lands almost completely flat. And this really isn't set up that stiff. That is absolutely amazing, guys. I honestly thought it was going to be more of a bounce based on just how soft it is. And there's a little bit of a bounce, but not much. And the beauty of it is you could put much thicker fluid in the shocks, take that center pill, open it up, and keep the exact same amount of rough terrain damping, yet get more jump handling damping. But honestly, I'm not sure you actually need it unless you're jumping 30 or 50 feet in the air. because this feels absolutely flat. It just stops dead when it lands. Let's see if we can get some real air out of it. Woohoo!
Guys, without some sort of feel-o-vision, it really is impossible to convey just how different this feels from anything else I've ever bashed. One thing I was really surprised about is in a turn, that piston goes into the heavily damped area, and it actually locks out how much it tips, which makes it less likely to roll over in a turn. Now, the reality is you could set up a really plush suspension, but it's not going to jump well. You can set up a really stiff suspension, but it's going to handle like crap over the rough stuff. This gives you the best of basically all worlds, and I definitely understand why high-end, full-size trucks use position-sensitive damping now. Obviously, what we were doing out there was not perfectly tuned. I'd probably go thicker on the fluid and put a looser center pill in, or maybe even take the center pill out altogether, I'm not sure. But that's the beauty of this thing. You can tune rough terrain damping how you want and jump landing damping how you want, and they'll be independent of each other. This genuinely feels like the future of bashing, and I'm super excited to be able to share this with you. I hope you had a great time watching this video. I am going to put a link down in the description to where you can pre-order these for the Kagama. It's not an affiliate link, so I don't get any kickbacks for it, but if you enjoyed watching this video, let me know by subscribing, hitting that thumbs up button, and leaving a comment down there.